Tonight we are meeting with the public to talk about the information we've gathered for our strategic plan for the next 10 years in terms of how it will guide us and the decisions we will make to enhance our system or continue to enhance our system, I should say.
We're here to kick off the strategic plan, the draft strategic plan, and we want the public to be able to see the results of the planning process that we've gone through for the last 9 months.
We've had so much going on. We've been so busy here at BREC, but we've been meeting. We've had 30 plus community input meetings. We had a number of special meetings with special interest groups. We've met with we've conducted surveys. We've met with different key leadership people. We have talked to just about everybody in the parish that we can talk to about what we want to do for the next 10 years.
We are now basically kicking off the public review period for the draft strategic plan. And what I hope to do tonight is just walk you through some of the things that influenced the direction of the plan, and then also what's in the plan itself. So just to review the process, basically there was a long period of public input at the beginning of the process, a number of workshops, area meetings, focus groups, community survey was conducted. All of that has continued on through the process to make sure that the plan does reflect the community's interest. From there, we basically took that input and we did a number of analyses to understand what the trends were in the parish. We looked at the recreational facilities, what their condition was, how they were being used. We looked at economic impacts of the park system. We also looked at demographic studies. We took all that, we began to identify what we are calling in the plan strategic directions. And those are a series of key directions that then identify what actions BREC should be taking over the next decade in order to move the park and open space system forward according to the direction of the community. We are now in the third and final stage where we have a draft strategic plan. It will be out for review for 3 weeks to get public comment, and then it will go to the commission for their review and comment, and ultimately we hope to have a final adopted plan by the end of the year. So there were a number of pieces to the specific plan process, or the strategic plan process. As I mentioned, there's public input, demographic studies, program analysis, there's a natural resource plan developed, there's a new cultural and historical facilities plan, which is a new component that the old strategic plan didn't include. You can read all the various components. I'll touch a little bit on some of those, but as you look at the plan, you'll be able to see more about what those actually incorporated. So the public input, as I mentioned, there was community survey, a scientifically valid statistical survey that was done so that we could get broad input that we know was representative of the parish as a whole. But then we've also had public meetings, we had a large parish-wide meeting like this. Then we also had 34 community meetings where we went to the local recreation centers throughout the parish, talked to people about what their concerns were, what their aspirations for the system were, and all of that has gone into the structuring of the plan. We also did 30 what we called stakeholder meetings and focus group interviews, and those were really to reach out to specific user groups, advocacy groups, partners for BREC, to find out what their interests were in terms of parks, recreation for the next decade, and how we could begin to move forward in that direction. We also had the Mind Mixer site, which is an online site in which we asked various questions and people were able to post their comments. Throughout the past 9 months, we've gotten approximately 2,100 visitors to that site. And then in addition to the external meetings we've had with you, the community, we've also had a number of meetings internally with BREC staff, because it's not just about what the community wants, but it's also about how BREC delivers its services. And we wanted to make sure that the strategic plan addressed both the external and the internal issues as we move forward. So some of the findings, we presented some of these before, but we thought it was worthwhile before getting into the detail of the strategic plan to actually just review sort of what led to the directions. As you can see, 80% of the households had used BREC's park during the past year. 85% of the public felt like the physical conditions of the parks was really good or excellent, which is compared to a lot of communities, that's a very high rating. 21% of the households have participated in some sort of BREC recreation program, and of those who have participated, 95% felt like those programs were really very good or excellent. So a very positive response from the survey. In terms of what was most important to the community, walking, biking trails were right at the top, as well as neighborhood parks. Playground areas, fitness and exercise facilities, family picnic areas, as you can see, all came in below that slightly. In terms of the programs that were ranked most highly, you can see that learning to swim and water fitness programs were both at the top of the list. So having aquatic recreation obviously is important. Cultural special events, adult continuing education programs, indoor space for small events, all ranked highly as well. In terms of highest priority actions, when we ask the community, what would you like to do first? Improving neighborhood parks came in at 34%. Improving trails, again, that connect to parks, came in at 25%. And then developing new outdoor swim pools and aquatic centers at 20%. And then you can see trails that connect parks came in again in a slightly different question, athletic fields. And then purchasing land to preserve natural areas also came in the top 6. Slightly different venue from the scientific survey. In the public meetings, we got slightly different answers, and so we're sort of using all of these inputs to try to balance what's proposed in the plan. So in terms of funding priorities at the public meetings, you can see that improvements to neighborhood parks and improvements to community parks came in very highly, and then community to recreation and senior centers also ranked quite highly. In terms of most important amenities, you can see, well, you may not be able to see, but the top ranking is walking and biking trails. So again, this theme of connectivity, the importance of trails is consistent through this. The second one is natural and conservation areas, and this is kind of interesting that it's coming out of the public meetings. This is quite a high ranking, and then right behind that is open green space. So those two together begin to suggest that there's an interest not just in recreational facilities and sort of sports type of parks, but just natural areas and open green space. When we ask the question about what kinds of trends do you see in parks and recreation, and how do you rate those? The one that really rose to the top was parks and public health. I'll address issues of obesity and such a little bit later in the parish, but this is a national trend in which the public's seen much more connection between using parks to get physical exercise, to begin to fight things like obesity, diabetes, that are directly related to lack of physical activity. And then the third one here is parks providing environmental benefits. So interesting focus on public health, health of the environment as trends that we should be considering in the strategic plan. In terms of common desires, the top couple include facilities where we can be active, more quality in terms of more quality facilities, more quality parks, and better maintenance. And then the fourth point here was about better information about what is available. And this, again, was a theme that came out in different ways, but many people just said they didn't know that many of the things that we talked about in the public meetings were actually existed, and that if they'd known about them, they actually would use them more. We asked the question about what was the most important special use facility, and the top three. The first is the Baton Rouge Zoo, which was consistent, again, with the previous strategic plans. This is a highly recognized facility within the BREC system. Bluebonnet Swamp and Nature Center was really highly rated as well. And then sports parks came in right behind that. So it was not necessarily a specific sports park, but the idea of sports parks where active recreation, active sports, league sports could take place. And then Liberty Lagoon, golf courses, the Botanic Gardens, the Baton Rouge Gallery, those all ranked highly as well. Then when we met with the stakeholders, again, similar themes, but you get slightly different takes on them, and just to summarize some of the key themes that we heard. Expanding multi-use trail connections, particularly to parks and also to employment centers. So it's about recreational trail use, but it's also about commuter trail use and how you begin to make those connections. There was a lot of discussion about expanding water-oriented recreation, and particularly on the parish's rivers. There's not a lot of canoeing and kayaking and such on the rivers at this point, and so there was a lot of discussion about how do we begin to move that forward, how do we begin to get access to the parish rivers in a responsible way to begin to satisfy this need. And then water features, water access, again, different kinds of water, spray pads, that sort of thing, were also highly valued. And then the idea of continuing to innovate and to introduce new kinds of recreation facilities was a theme that many of the stakeholders talked about. Again, the idea that making people aware, actually marketing BREC's facilities and parks would really help the community understand what was available and would enhance usership. The idea that you have special events that begin to bring people to parks so that then they understand what's available and then they come back to recreate on an individual basis. There was talk about sort of concern about affordability in terms of the fees that are required at some parks, and there was also a concern about sort of the competitive nature, particularly came out in terms of sort of soccer leagues, baseball leagues, and how they've gotten so specialized that they're not necessarily good for everybody, they're only good for the most talented. And so how do you begin to balance that and make sure that there are facilities, those kinds of facilities for everyone, and not just those who have exceptional talents or who have more resources to pay for that. And then the other point that was identified was the need for adult programs. And this is not just for seniors, but for all adults. There was a real interest in, there's a focus oftentimes in Parks and Recreation on kids and what they're doing, but how do we begin to bring the entire community into the parks and provide them with programs that they're interested in as well? There was a lot of discussion about the need to nurture new partnerships in a time of constrained resources, not only BREC, but also the various agencies and nonprofits that BREC works with also have limited resources. And so the idea that all of these groups need to work together more to make sure that they're leveraging their resources and not duplicating efforts. The idea of focusing on improving communication, this is between partners, but it's also, again, with the public. Again, one of the partners to work with are the school districts, and the idea of expanding integration with schools so that you're not building playgrounds on the school and then BREC's building a playground adjacent to it, but that you begin to think collaboratively about how you provide those recreation facilities so that they can be jointly used and jointly developed. And then the idea that small improvements within existing parks can actually greatly enhance the use, and this was mentioned, I remember specifically in terms of like some of the baseball fields, that if you had lights, if you had scoreboards, it opens up a broader range of users if you do that. We also looked at sort of what the demographic and economic trends were, both nationally but also in the parish, to begin to understand, things are not the same as they were 10 years ago. what are the implications of that for the park and recreation system? First of all, these are mostly things you probably read in the news, but the population's getting older. By 2030, 1 in 5 Americans will be over the age of 65. So we're going to have a much larger segment of the population that is elderly. And the projection for the parish is that I think by 2030 it's approximately a quarter of the population. So how do you begin to provide recreational opportunities and programming for that part of the community? We're also more diverse than we used to be. By 2050, that there will be no majority race in the U.S. And that's definitely reflected in this parish. There are also more single-person households. By mid-2020s, it will be the predominant household type. I mean, that's only 6 years away. The fact that a lot of people are living alone, either as empty nesters or just as single young people. And then the reality that there has been a stagnation in household incomes. And the fact is that even as the economy begins to rebound, household incomes are still roughly 9% less than they were, a dozen years or so ago. So how do you begin to think about what's needed in terms of recreation, in terms of what people have to spend, but also what can BREC do with limited resources to begin to meet community demand when there's less resources available. Some population statistics. The 4 cities in the parish basically represent like 60%, 2/3 of the population of the parish, but a full third of that is in the unincorporated areas. And so how you begin to think about where people live in terms of where facilities are is very important. In terms of population growth, Louisiana as a state is growing much slower than most states. You can see that the Baton Rouge Metropolitan Statistical Area grew by 14.5% compared to only 2.5% for the state. But what's interesting as you look at the statistics under that, the city of Baton Rouge during that same period only grew by 1%. So the metropolitan area grew by 14.5%, but the city of Baton Rouge grew by 1%. The parish grew by 7.2%. So what you're beginning to see in those numbers is that most of the growth in the last decade is occurring outside the city of Baton Rouge. It's either occurring in the small cities or in the unincorporated areas. So again, how do you think about what the implication for the location of parks, the locations of facilities, the location and offerings of recreational programs is going to be? So with those growth characteristics, basically what's happening is that the parish, even though it's the most populous parish in the area, is shrinking in terms of its proportion of the overall region. So it's declined in the last decade from approximately 62% of the parish or of the region's population to about 55%. There's also an outmigration phenomenon that's happening in this parish where a number of families, particularly young families, are moving to neighboring parishes, oftentimes for school, better school districts. But the fact is they still live or they still work in East Baton Rouge. So what's happening is that, one, it adds traffic to the roads, which I'm sure you see, but also it means that oftentimes those people who are working here are still getting their recreation services and using parish parks. So it's an interesting, even though the population is declining to an average net loss of about 2,700 residents a year, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're also getting a decline in the demand on parks and recreation. The parish is projected to grow slower in the next decade. It's only about 2%, so down from the 14.5% that it grew in the past decade. And there's also a shift in terms of where people are living. Densities are really increasing, and the population's really increasing in the southern part of the parish much more rapidly than it is in other parts of the parish. So again, all of these things we need to take into account as we begin to project where demand for facilities is, where demand for recreation programs is going to be. This map begins to show, it may be a little hard to read on the screen, but basically it combines density, population density with driving distance from community parks, and the bluish, the darker the blue basically shows the better the coverage in terms of people's access to community parks within 10-minute drive. And you can begin to see how, as you get to the more rural areas to the north, the coverage is not as intense. But what's also interesting here is if you look at the southeast corner of the parish, where I've just said that population has been growing, you begin to see that the coverage is not as good there. And so that's one of the things that's come out of the analysis, is that there is need for facilities down in the southeast portion of the parish. Race and ethnicity also plays an interesting role. Obviously, you're aware of the fact that there's distinct racial divide in the parish. What's interesting is over the last decade, whereas the white population used to be about 60%, it's now dropped down to closer to 49%. And so the white population and the black population is just about equal. Couple things that come out of that. One is that they're not evenly distributed across the parish, but there's a clear divide, with Florida Boulevard being the dividing line. Most of the white population lives south of Florida. Most of the black population lives north of that. And why this becomes interesting and important is because then if you look at the income gap that's associated with that, basically the per capita income in the parish, there's like 114% difference between per capita income for the white population versus the black population. So how do we begin to think about parks and recreation and the services that are provided when you have such extreme differences in terms of what people are able to afford and where they're living? Not related to race, but related to public health. Again, you've probably read about this in the papers, seen it on television, but there's a growing concern about public health related to lack of physical activity, lack of good eating habits, lack of healthy food, and particularly diseases such as obesity, diabetes. And studies have shown that Louisiana, as a state, basically ranks 49th in the nation out of 50 states in terms of obesity. So it's a major issue in the state, and while we don't have specific figures for the parish, we expect that they must be pretty similar. Similarly, Louisiana ranks 47th in terms of physical activity, with only about 34% of the people being physically active. Just by comparison, this is about twice the number in the most active state, which happens to be Colorado, where the amount of people who don't get physical activity is only about 16%. So looking at how, going back to what we heard from the stakeholders and from the community about providing more active opportunities, providing more trails so people can get more exercise, again, how we begin to tie public health, physical activity into the strategic plan directions. Again, this is a graphic looking at median household income, and again, it may be hard to see in this light, but basically you can begin to see that the higher median household incomes are in the north and the southeast, while the central part of the parish, both north and south and east and west, tends to be more moderate in income. Again, so has implications for where facilities are located and what they provide. So with that background, as we begin to look at the strategic plan itself, I'm going to just sort of touch on some of the high points. And one of the things that the Imagine Your Parks strategic plan of 2004 did was to articulate a mission statement for BREC, and it's on the screen, and it was basically to provide parks and recreational opportunities for all citizens of East Baton Rouge Parish. As we begin to talk with BREC staff, with BREC's partners, the public, it became clear that BREC's aspirations for itself and the community's aspirations for BREC were higher than the mission statement in the previous document. And so we spent some time actually crafting a new mission statement. It's not radically different in kind, but it has two key components to it. One, as you can see, it says to contribute to a healthier, more vibrant community. So the first part of this is about the fact that it's parks and recreation contribute something to the parish and to the community. It's not just that they're providing parks and recreation, but those parks and recreation really serve a role in enhancing the quality of life within the parish. And they do that by providing exceptional parks, open space, and recreation experiences. So whereas the last mission statement said it wanted to provide opportunities and didn't qualify what kind of opportunities, this is being more explicit. BREC is really interested in providing exceptional parks, open space, and recreation experiences. Not only do you have the opportunity to go there, but you actually have a good experience once you get there. So I think the point of sort of emphasizing this is that I think BREC is interested in expressing and articulating what its aspirations are, and it expects the community then to hold it accountable in terms of that mission statement and to also assist in fulfilling that mission statement. One thing that wasn't in the previous strategic plan that we thought was important was not just the mission statement for BREC, but what is the vision? What's the long-term vision for parks and open space and recreation in the parish itself? And the vision statement that was crafted is as follows: an extraordinary system of parks, open spaces, and facilities that engages the parish's unique natural and cultural landscape to enrich parish life by providing diverse and memorable recreation experiences. So again, it goes into the fact that this is not just generic parks and recreation, that we're looking to have really quality parks and recreation. And it's not just about your typical ball fields, swimming pools, but it's about the natural and cultural landscape and how you find recreational opportunities in that, and how that all contributes to an enhanced quality of life for the people who live in East Baton Rouge Parish. In addition, BREC staff wanted to articulate what the values are that drive them as they do their work on a day-to-day basis. And oftentimes on the day-to-day basis, this is hard to keep in mind. And so it was good, I think, a good exercise. We sat down and worked with the entire staff to begin to articulate what the guiding values for BREC are. And as you can see, they're excellence, service, engagement, meaning engagement with the community, collaboration, meaning collaboration internally, but also with the public at large, with other partners. It's about integrity. It's about equity. It's about making sure that the services are provided equitably to all people of the parish. It's about safety, making sure that the opportunities and facilities that are provided are safe. It's about professionalism, taking pride in the kind of work that BREC does and ensuring that it meets best practices. It's about sustainability. It's about creating a system that is resilient and sustainable over time from a physical standpoint, from an environmental standpoint, from an economic standpoint. And it's about fiscal responsibility. It's ensuring that the money, that the funding that comes from the public to BREC is invested responsibly and invested in a way that the community expects it to be. So these are the articulated values. As you review the plan, there's a brief description of each of these. We'd be interested in getting your feedback on these as part of the plan. Just a bit about the structure of the plan. As I mentioned, there are a series of strategic directions that are identified. And then for each strategic direction, there are actions. And just to walk you through this, so this is an example. Programs is one of the topic areas for which there is a strategic direction provided. Then there is a strategic direction, and I'll go into each of these later. And then for each strategic direction, there are a number of actions that are identified about what would you do to actually get that, to achieve that strategic direction. And then there's, for each action, there's a rationale, an explanation of why that action would be helpful towards implementation. And then there are a number of more detailed steps that identify what needs to be done to fulfill the actions, who should be doing that. So this is the structure that you'll see when you go and look at the report, and just so you can understand. So there are, what are there, 9 strategic directions, or 9 topic areas. They are fiscal responsibility, programs, parks and facilities, trails, natural resources, marketing and communication, partnerships, maintenance and operations. And these were all sort of key points that came out during the public review or the public input process that said these are places that you need to be focusing on in the next 10 years. So I'll walk through each of these. I'm not going to sort of dwell on them, but I want to give you a sense of what's there, and you can go to the strategic plan, read the actions, and then so the bullet points you see there are basically action items that are under the strategic direction. In the plan, there are a whole series of action steps that then begin to amplify and explain how these will be implemented. So fiscal responsibility, basically the strategic direction is to continue to place a priority on the wise use of taxpayer dollars. And this is about continuing to plan, deliver, maintain programs in an equitable and balanced manner. It's also about looking at developing a fees and charges policy and program that begins to look at how to generate revenue, how that revenue should be generated to begin to help support the operations and make BREC a more sustainable agency. It's about thinking about cost and benefits seriously as BREC thinks about designing and implementing new facilities, so that they're thinking in advance, what is this going to cost to maintain? What's the benefit to the public going to be? So we're making sure that we're not investing money in things that are not going to be used by very many people. Also about tracking and reporting revenues, direct and indirect costs, just so that BREC has a better idea about where its money is going and making sure that the benefit is positive. And then continuing to do what they have done very successfully for the past decade, is to explore new ways of doing business that begin to find more system-wide efficiencies, so that the provision of services and programs throughout the parish really it becomes less expensive per capita than it currently is. It becomes much more efficient. And just, this was a slide that we actually presented at the last public meeting, but it's the idea of cost recovery targets. And this is still in process, and we're looking at how this will actually get implemented. But the idea is that you have sort of core essential types of programs, and then you have important programs, and then you have value-added programs. And basically the distinction is core essential are those programs that provide broad public benefit, and then the value-added tend to be more individual benefit. And as you move on that continuum from broad public benefit to individual benefit, you can begin to see that there's the potential for increased cost recovery as you move more towards those things that are only serving individuals in terms of the benefit provided. Obviously a very sensitive issue, and it's again going back to the demographics about what people can afford in the parish. You want to make sure that your cost recovery programs are not discouraging recreation, but they're supporting good, positive recreation and supporting good, well-maintained facilities. In terms of programs, and the programs, this is recreational programming. The strategic direction is to continue innovation in recreation programming while incorporating health and wellness into program design and development. So there's a real emphasis in thinking about how do we begin to put this health and wellness piece into our programming in a real conscious and intentional way, not just in an accidental way. Things like, just slipped out of my mind, BREC on the go? Is that the truck that goes out and goes to the public and brings them recreation? I mean, that's exactly the sort of thing that BREC is going to continue to think about how you begin to integrate recreation with public health, even if it means taking it to them rather than having them come to you. Developing an integrated and system-wide plan that aligns program with market demand as well as the needs of the underserved, so that you're really beginning to look at what's needed in the marketplace, what's not being fulfilled. I know at our last public meeting, we actually had a contingent here that said, we really need cricket fields. Are they fields? Cricket? I'm not even sure what the unit is, but the market changes. As the population changes, there's a different demand for different kinds of facilities, different kinds of programming, and BREC needs to continue to pay attention to that, to figure out what the right balance is. Enhancing special events programming, one, not just for the parish, but as to bring people from the region and from the nation in. This is one, to make it more interesting for the local population, but it's also a revenue generation issue about how you can begin to use the facilities you have in a way that begins to bring revenue in, that begins to complement and leverage public dollars that are spent on the park system. Implementing best practices in terms of life cycle management. You can read more about this in the strategic plan, but basically different kinds of recreation programs tend to have a life cycle in which there's a demand that builds up and then eventually it sort of matures, and then oftentimes interest in that program declines. And rather than just continuing to maintain facilities that support programs that have declined, one of the things that BREC needs to do is to continue to monitor the life cycle of the various programs that it offers and those that it doesn't offer, and see what needs to be added into the system. And then finally, implementing the strategic plan for golf. There's a separate strategic plan that's being developed for golf, and that will actually be included as basically an appendix to this, but so that the strategic direction here is to ensure implementation of that. In terms of parks and facilities, the strategic direction is to continue to raise the standard for parks and recreation facilities and ensure equitable access to recreation experiences parish-wide. Efficiently and effectively implementing the capital improvement program, which I'll say a little bit more about in a minute. Planning with life cycle replacement schedule to govern capital investment. Upgrading and providing new parks facilities to address shortcomings and meeting user needs. Improving design and construction, or improving design, and then also having construction and maintenance guidelines. One of the new things that has been added, as I mentioned before, is really looking at the historic and cultural resources within the parish, how those begin to be integrated. Some things are already part of the system. Magnolia Mound is sort of the preeminent example. How you begin to introduce cultural interpretation, historical education as part of the recreational experience, and as part of building stewardship among the community for preserving those valuable assets within a park and open space setting. So there's more about that in the plan as well. And then finally, as with golf, there's a separate strategic plan being developed for the zoo, and looking to implement that as well over the next decade. Again, just a couple words about the Historic Cultural Resources Plan. A couple of the key actions that are proposed in that is one, first of all, just to inventory what the existing resources are within the parish. And this is really just to provide a database so that the BREC can understand what's available, what needs to be maintained, what's accessible. And then beginning to establish guidelines for the treatment of historic resources that are within BREC's current parks. At this point, there isn't really a standardized, comprehensive set of guidelines. It's basically sort of resource by resource, and so this is really setting a standard and thinking intentionally about, what are our guidelines for managing historic resources. And then also establishing an internal design review process that begins to look at, what the implications are for upgrades and changes to resources or to parks and facilities that have historic resources to ensure that you're not detracting from the value of the historic resource. And then the idea of establishing interpretive and educational programming within facilities. So really expanding this to begin to identify, what are the themes that should be guiding education and interpretation of these resources, and how do those begin to get implemented? Who do we partner with to provide that sort of service, rather than necessarily training a whole new group of staff within BREC? So anyway, developing that plan for how this is going to be done. As I mentioned, one of the actions was to implement the capital improvement program. There is a initial capital improvement program, 2015 to 2024, that BREC prepared, and this really looks at sort of the high-level, immediate-term capital improvements that they see. It's not comprehensive by any means, and if you can't see it, basically the 10-year capital improvement budget is about $73 million, and the additional identified funding needed to hit that $73 million is about $52 million. So there's a big chunk of funding that's needed in order to just provide this sort of improvements, whether it be parking lots, whether it be finishing up improvements to community parks that have already been identified in the previous strategic plan, whether it's beginning to advance the connectivity of trails. This is all going to cost money, and we need to, part of the strategic plan is to figure out how much money that is and how that's going to be allocated. The next strategic direction is about trails, and it's to enhance connectivity by improving the network of multi-use trails within, between parks and community assets. And this is really about BREC beginning to take a leading role in trails. It hasn't in the past necessarily. They've done some trail work, but it hasn't been a real focus. But between Future BR, which identified trails as a major focus of the community, and the input that we've gotten through this process, it's clear that the parish community is very interested in having trails. There were comments about, well, it's fine to have trails, but we now have a lot of trails that sort of dead end and don't connect to anything. So how you begin to create linkages amongst existing trails to begin to really expand the functionality of the network. Also introducing trail use monitoring so that you begin to understand which trails are being used, who they're being used by, what kinds of activities are taking place there. Developing trail standards for the parish so that you begin to get consistent, well-designed trails throughout the parish. And then beginning to provide, again, communication, education to the community about, what's out there in terms of the trail system and how they can be involved in it and how it can be used. Natural resources is the next area, and the strategic direction is to strengthen and increase natural resource related recreational opportunities. Again, one of the things BREC has done just this past year is to develop a natural resources management plan, which goes into this in much more detail, and that will be appended to this strategic plan, so you can read more about that. But the strategic actions that we've identified are about developing a land acquisition and easement acquisition program to begin to look at how do you create not just isolated bits of natural area, but begin to create an integrated and connected natural system. And the focus that we heard throughout the stakeholder interviews and public input was that that really should focus on blueways, the waterways, as a natural component, and then other greenways, whether it be rail lines where you can begin to create continuous corridors that connect the natural areas. Again, resource interpretation, making all the resources available to the public in a way that they get excited about, that you begin to build stewardship for the future about getting young people excited about maintaining the natural environment as an important component of the parish. And then also building on BREC's Go Green program, begin to just strengthen sustainability as a activity throughout the parish. And then just a little bit more about the Natural Resources Management Plan. It has 3 primary goals, which is about promoting activities on focusing on appreciation and understanding of the natural environment, protecting unique and historically sensitive habitats, and then reducing loss of species diversity within the parish. And as you can see, there are a whole number of benefits associated with that: improved air quality, water retention, wildlife habitat. So again, I would refer you to the Natural Resources Management Plan if you're interested in that. Marketing and communication is the next strategic direction, and it's about increasing local awareness of BREC's programs and facilities and the overall value of BREC. Again, as I've already talked about, this is, there are many facilities out there. There are community parks, there are special use parks and facilities. Most of the community probably only knows a fraction of them, and so how do you make those more available to the public? And it's about creating a marketing plan, developing marketing communication materials. It's about engaging communities adjacent to BREC's parks and facilities about what's actually happening at those parks, so that they understand what's happening in their own neighborhoods, what they can take part in. As I mentioned, it's also about regional tourism. It's about generating revenue, generating excitement, bringing regional programming into local venues. And then it's about also looking at how to link into technology to better communicate with the public using online and social media. BREC already has a very good program with this, but as you all know, this continues to change almost daily, and so it's an activity that BREC really needs to keep up with in order to communicate effectively with the community. Partnerships. This was a huge area of discussion during all of our meetings, and it's working with partners and the BREC Foundation as a key one to achieve common goals and to leverage resources. Actions include supporting and strengthening BREC's volunteer program. It's about ensuring that BREC and its partners have fair and equitable relationships, that if BREC provides something, that partners provide something in return, and vice versa. And it's also about streamlining processes of identifying need for donor support and reaching out to donors to provide that support. So again, a very important part of the new strategic plan. And then last but not least, maintenance and operations. And this is about ensuring that BREC's parks and facilities are operated and maintained according to best practices and to a level expected by the community. As I've already said, the general feedback from the community is that they see that most of the facilities are well maintained, but that means that standard has to be continued. Internally, it's about reviewing staffing to make sure that staffing levels are geared towards facilities. If we're talking about new programs, new facilities, those have staffing requirements, and we need to make sure that as we grow, as we change, that the staffing needs are being met. It's about also training BREC staff to make sure that they know how to effectively manage, operate the facilities that BREC has and the programs that they have. Again, it's about looking at operational and maintenance requirements up front as you begin to plan and design new facilities, and not design and plan new facilities and say, whoops, that takes a lot more effort to maintain than we thought it was going to. So really being intentional about thinking about what are the operational and maintenance requirements associated with this. Pursuing increased funding for major maintenance activities, replacement of aging infrastructure, equipment that's necessary to maintain. Currently, what's in the BREC budget is enough to maintain sort of general maintenance, but it's not enough to deal with sort of major maintenance issues, the fact that there's a lot of aging infrastructure. So there's a funding issue that needs to be addressed as we move forward about, it's not only about capital projects, about building new parks, new facilities. Once you have them, you have to maintain them, and so that has a cost as well. And then another thing that BREC has already been working on, but really identifying surplus and underutilized parklands, whether they be undeveloped or developed, and if they're not providing a good benefit to the community, to actually begin to dispose of those in a way so that you're not spending limited operations and maintenance dollars on facilities that are either underutilized or not developed at all and just need to be maintained. So that was a lot. You'll get more out of the plan itself. As I say, this is the beginning of a 3-week public review period. Actually, we're looking for public comment by October 15th, which is 3 weeks from today. You can get the strategic plan. You can download it from BREC's website, and it's at www.brec.org/IYP2, which is Imagine Your Parks 2. And comments can be delivered. You can either send an email directly to planning@brec.org, and this is really the preferred way because it'll be much easier for BREC staff to begin to assemble these comments. You can also go to MindMixer. The MindMixer site is still up, and you can put your comments there as well. And if you want, you can also write them on a piece of paper. You can stick them in an envelope and mail them to BREC, attention, strategic plan at 6201 Florida Boulevard. So we really would like the community to review the document, to provide your insight, because while this is BREC's strategic plan that will tell them what they should be doing, it needs to have the voice of the community behind it so that BREC feels assured that it's doing what the community desires it to do. So with that, I thank you for coming. We are going to be in the back. There are a number of BREC staff in the house, and if you have questions, would like to talk to any of us about that, we'll be here for a while. But I do encourage you, get the plan, take a look at it, and send us your comments. Thanks very much.
I would like people to at least go online onto our website, get a copy of the plan, read it, give us feedback, give us input to make sure we got it right, because it's important that we do it right the first time. And our focus is to make sure that the people know that we heard them, that they understand what we're talking about doing over the next 10 years, and that we are making wise use of their tax dollars.
The highlights of the process is we're entering a new decade, and this is really the strategic direction for the Parks and Recreation and BREC for the next decade.
They should go to our website, which is www.brec.org, or MindMixer, and you can give us your input and feedback and continue to share with us. Give us a call, stop by, whatever. We'd like to hear from you.